Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Today's conversation, as many of you know, is part of a 3-day virtual conference that we convened this week to mark 1 year American Purpose. Welcome many friends, colleagues, Frank Fukuyama, co-founder, chair of our editorial board, Craig Kennedy, board member, senior advisor, fellow, and so forth. Too many to name by name. Let me just get to the main event. That's what you all are waiting for. So welcome, Robert D. Zoellick, Bob Zoellick. What a pleasure and what a privilege this is. Bob Zoellick doesn't need an introduction, but he deserves one. And I will not tell you, but remind you that he is a former president of the World Bank. He's served as Deputy Secretary of State. He's served as U.S. Trade Representative. He is also, among many other things, author of a 2020 book. Now I'm going to hold it up. These are the uncorrected page proofs. I have it on Kindle, on iPad. It's good for him to hold up a book. So I'm holding up the pre-book, but it is splendid and it is substantial. It's titled America and the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Bob brings to us things that I think that we are in urgent need of today. And I will mention deep knowledge, experience, history, and a compass. And my, oh my, in times like these, we need all those things, including a compass. We have agreed that Bob will introduce the topic, which we've titled after his book, America in the World, and he will take somewhere around 30, perhaps 40 minutes to speak. We will have time for Q&A, hard stop at after 75 minutes. That would be, do I have this right, 3:15 Eastern, but welcome to everybody. We have others joining us, but we're going to go ahead and begin. Bob, great to see you. Thank you for making time.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a real privilege to take part in the first year anniversary conference for American Purpose. And I'm pleased to have this opportunity to thank you, Jeff, but also Michelle and now Rebecca Burgess for your entrepreneurial leadership in this venture. And of course, Frank Fukuyama always adds sparkle to a program, so I'm delighted to be on anything with Frank. Now, most of you probably know Frank as a political philosopher and public intellectual, and that's true enough. But I first met Frank when he was a deputy, along with Bill Burns, on Dennis Ross's policy planning staff at the State Department in 1989. So I know that Frank has a practical and creative role as a policymaker as well. In fact, he played a very important role, as Craig Kennedy knows, in terms of helping to devise the 2+4 process for German unification in 1989. So I wasn't surprised over the years when I saw that Frank's writings on legitimacy and accountability, institutions, governance, drew on the importance of performance. So today, I'd like to take an approach to performance in the context of U.S. foreign policy. As all of you are well aware, American foreign policy seems to be the subject of uncertainty and great debate these days. And it's natural after the disruptions of the Trump era, questions about Biden's directions, and of course, the retrospectives after the 20th anniversary of 9/11. The commentary to yearn for grand strategies and big concepts and guiding principles. Now, as Jeff mentioned, I recently published a book, America and the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, that offers a little bit of a different approach. I try to tell the stories of how leading Americans sought to address the foreign policy problems of their eras over some 200 years, from Ben Franklin in Paris during our revolution to George Herbert Walker Bush in 1989 and 92. And at the advice of a good faculty seminar, I close with an afterword that briefly examines the Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and a bit of the Trump policies through the lens of 5 traditions. So the book focuses on people and particular episodes to highlight the practical problem-solving work of diplomacy. And I add my assessments and insights on the conduct of diplomacy. So Frank Fukuyama might conclude that I'm examining the performance. So why did I take this approach? When I was in government, I drew upon history when thinking through problems, more often to ask questions rather than to find analogies, which, while natural, sometimes can be very misleading. So I wanted to encourage others, particularly a younger generation, to draw upon history. Many foreign policy courses these days seem to be taught through the lens of international relations theories. And that's intellectually challenging, and they're fun to debate. But I found them of limited use when I worked on issues like German unification or Central and Eastern Europe, the fall of the Soviet Union, trade strategy, or genocide in Darfur, World Bank and development, climate change, or China policy. Now, probably like many of you, I read Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy in the 90s, and I enjoyed the way he tried to use or sought to use history to explain foreign policy. But of course, Dr. Kissinger's perspective is one of European realpolitik, which, while valuable, I think doesn't cover the full gamut of the American experience. So I wanted to use this book to add to the pluralism of ideas from the American experience. But I had another motive too, and that is when I was in public service, I would often ask my younger colleagues about the history that they knew, because I honestly didn't have a sense of what they learned. And maybe at times they felt a little bit tortured by my questioning, but I discovered that insofar as they had learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. But America's first 150 years included some fascinating figures and tales, and I wanted to recall some of these people from the mists of time. I also wanted to suggest that it's okay to achieve imperfect results in a far from perfect world. Perhaps I can offer a tinge of optimism. History can offer insights on how to do better, as well as just the notion of timeless obstacles. Now, this audience in particular will recognize that one of the theses that I draw of pragmatism in addressing problems has a very respectable intellectual provenance in America. William James and John Dewey, the leading philosophers of pragmatism, rejected artificial intellectual conventions, abstractions, dogmas. They began with problems. They looked to experience. They sought to match means with ends to try to fix the situation. Pragmatists recognize the roles of chance and contingency. They acknowledge the natural dynamism in the world, appreciate pluralism, and understand the need for experimentation. At root, they prize results over theories. Now, I believe that pragmatism in diplomacy follows a similar logic. Pragmatic diplomats pay attention to realities on the ground of power, whether economic, military capabilities, technology, votes. Pragmatists have to understand how institutions and processes work in reality. Pragmatists have to assess the interests and positions of others, and a good sense of timing is important as well. Pragmatists, of course, recognize the appeal of visions and big ideas, but they tend to pursue them flexibly. They may be motivated by ideologies, but not rigidly. Pragmatists tend to be skeptical of one simple formula to producing success. And as a matter of reality, leaders, of course, have to juggle multiple issues and interests. And the successful ones are the ones that will seek to achieve their objectives and then move them closer to their visionary aims. My book suggests that American diplomacy has usually been guided by pragmatism. Of course, the skill and performance of US leaders, and importantly, their teams, have varied over the years. Now, I'd love to share some of the stories about people and problems in my book, but I suppose I'd best direct you to have a chance to read it. And therefore, what I'll use the bulk of my time to do is to discuss 5 traditions that emerge from my accounts. because I think these traditions may offer some helpful reference points for America in the world today and for the future as well. First, the importance of North America to US foreign policy. Now, this may seem like an ironic one because if you examine the websites of most foreign policy institutes, you'll find studies of Europe, the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, Latin America, sometimes Africa, but rarely North America. Of course, most of this audience will recall the importance of North America to the United States in the 19th century, but it was true in the 20th century too. We almost went to war again with Mexico in 1916. In 1917, Imperial Germany told Mexico that it could regain Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined in the war against the United States. For some reason, Berlin left out California. I don't know what plans they had for that one. The major nuclear showdown in the Cold War was over Cuba in the Caribbean. And later in the 20th century, Ronald Reagan recognized North America's strategic importance. I came across this speech he wrote launching his presidential campaign in 1979. And the rhetoric would be quite different from that we've heard in recent years. Reagan reasoned, quote, "The key to our own future security may lie in Mexico and Canada becoming much stronger countries than they are today. And it's time that we stop thinking of our nearest neighbors as foreigners." A little different from what we've heard recently. Now, the negotiation for NAFTA in 1991 and 92 was about much more than a trade agreement. With the end of the Cold War, the old corporate structure of the PRI, the governing party in Mexico since the 1920s, was starting to break down. And in such a corporate structure, all the institutions, the government, the legal system, the police, the unions, the education, they were all connected in a pyramid of power. So the key question was, where would Mexico's institutions and public look to for models and inspiration and reconnection? Now, over 30 years, Mexico's economic institutions linked to a North American idea have modernized pretty well, but not so for the institutions of rule of law, those of fighting crime and corruption, education, and labor unions. But consider with North America as well, the foreign policy issues that seem to be of greatest importance to the American public: immigration, narcotics and crime, the environment, economics. These are the key items on the North American agenda. But I also believe that North American policy should be about more than defensive actions. North America is the continental base from which all three countries, but particularly the United States, will extend their influence around the world. So our vision should be of three democracies, almost 500 million people, energy self-sufficiency and ability to export, a shared skilled labor force that benefits from investment in human capital as opposed to seeing the people as a problem, an integrated infrastructure connected to an interconnected economies, shared environmental bounty, and closer security cooperation on threats of all kinds. Now, the good news is that the work of 30 years has created ties in North America that even President Trump couldn't dismantle. And the rewrite of NAFTA, the USMCA, improves some features, but it weakens others. So the US challenge today is how to focus on the practical steps to strengthen this continental base. Now, the second tradition is that of trade, transnationalism, and technology. Probably everyone in this audience recalls that John Adams served with Thomas Jefferson on a small committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. But you probably don't know that at the same time, Adams was the chair of a committee that was supposed to draft the Model Treaty of 1776. It's basically a trade agreement. The point is that from its earliest days, US trade policy was about more than economic efficiency. Trade has been fundamental to US ties with the world. Recall that the world of 1776 was a world of empires, mercantilism. So the idea behind this first US treaty was to pry open space for private parties, today what we'd call transnational actors. So Americans in the world were the mariners, the merchants, the missionaries, the educators, the engineers, sometimes soldiers of fortune, doctors and nurses, civil society groups, NGOs. And private actors have long been the agents of America's influence in the world. And historically, the United States has sought to advance the rules, standards, norms, and cultural context to encourage this transnationalism. Technology has also been a very important part of America in the world, and I believe it will continue to be. I included a chapter on a man named Eaver Bush, who's in fact the godfather of US science policy in World War II and after World War II. Now, Eaver Bush won't probably appear in most books about US foreign policy, but his 1945 report, Science, the Endless Frontier, recognized that America needed to look beyond geographical frontiers. Bush invented what became known as the triple helix: basic research funded by the US government, working through universities, and connected to the private sector. Bush was a bit of an iconoclast, and he recognized that liberty could create a place for mavericks, but who could also support progress and security in liberal societies. I think the US system for science and technology was key to the success in the Cold War, in contrast to the Soviet Union's centralized, ossified system that could not adjust, particularly to information technology. And I suspect that the US system for science and technology, with space for creativity, flexibility, learning systems, debate, entrepreneurship, changing paradigms of thought, will also be fundamental to the competition with China. But I also wanted to draw attention to technology and science because I think in the future and today, we'll face a special challenge of integrating science into foreign policy and diplomacy. And just consider the issues of debate about climate change or future biological security. Third, the idea of alliances has long been fundamental to US foreign policy. First as a warning and a negative, and then as a cornerstone. We all recall that Washington warned against permanent alliances, and Jefferson extended the prohibition to entangling alliances because Americans associated them with European militarism, monarchs, balance of power, and warfare. In some ways, you could summarize the first 150 years of American foreign policy as a search for ways to interact with the world without alliances. Trade and economics was one aspect. The idea of a new world diplomacy among independent democracies was another. One that's been lost over time has been that, for those of you who recall the writings in the 1830s and 40s, the notion of the Union had almost a mystical appeal before the Civil War. And after the Union was preserved, the idea of cooperation through various confederations took hold as an idea. By the opening of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt became a mediator in foreign policy because he wanted to preserve the balance of power among great powers to avoid what he saw as a potential conflagration, which came shortly after he left office. Later, Woodrow Wilson sought to transform the idea of neutrality, an important concept going back to Alexander Hamilton, into the idea of collective security. And international law was another important theme. But in 1947, 1949, quite by accident, the United States invented a new type of alliance system. And this is an excellent example of practical problem solving and its legacies. You may know or recall that the original idea behind the Marshall Plan was to provide economic assistance to avoid military commitment to Europe. But it turned out that early on, Marshall and his colleagues discovered that the Marshall Plan wouldn't work without Germany. So the United States promoted a new Federal Republic of Germany. Yet the prospect of the Federal Republic of Germany led to the Berlin blockade and then airlift. And as the Federal Republic of Germany's Western neighbors were anxious because this idea of Germany's revitalization within 4 years of World War II was of deep concern. So the United States accepted the idea of a North Atlantic alliance to protect from the East and to reassure the West. The economic and security aspects of alliance partnerships have been a challenge to manage for 70 years. Sometimes we look at these through rose-colored glasses. For example, how far do you extend the guarantee of security to West Berlin, to Vietnam? Nixon's doctrine in the early 1970s called for an adjustment of sharing of burdens. I suspect if you look at the overall historical record, that President Bush 41 and his partnership with James Baker may offer the model for effective alliance leadership, a challenge, of course, we're still facing today to see the new nature of alliance partnerships. Now, the fourth tradition is the importance of congressional and public support. Foreign policy experts often overlook this one as well. When you read about Kennan's opinion of Congress, you can see why Dean Acheson wanted to keep him a long distance away from the Hill. Ben Franklin had to carefully maintain support with the Continental Congress while negotiating in Paris. But he was realistic about the challenge. When his colleague Henry Laurens suggested after they completed this fantastic treaty with Britain that Franklin had earned the appreciation of the Congress and his country, Franklin replied, "I have never yet known of a peace made that did not occasion a great deal of public discontent, clamor, and censure on both sides. The blessings promised to peacemakers, I fancy, relate to the next world, not this one." Thomas Jefferson was quite shrewd in channeling congressional frustrations with France, concerns about Mississippi and New Orleans, into a threat of bargaining with Paris. And he sent James Monroe, who was an official trusted by the Westerners, to negotiate. Lincoln observed that, quote, "public opinion is everything in this country." Now, in the book, I use in particular the example of Senator Vandenberg of Michigan and his relationship with Truman to illustrate how skilled congressional leaders have shaped foreign policy. But we could consider more recent examples, such as Senators Lugar or McCain. And we can ask, who might play such roles in Congress today? Now, my fifth and final tradition is the belief that America should serve a larger purpose. I didn't use the term exceptionalism, but American foreign policy has been imbued from the start with the idea of a larger purpose. And the best anecdote I can share with you to convey this idea starts with those of you that still carry wallets. Take out a dollar bill out of your wallet sometime and look at the back. That's the Great Seal of the United States, and perhaps you've never studied it too closely. But you'll see on the reverse that there's an unfinished pyramid, and note, it's unfinished. It's topped by the Eye of Providence, and below it, the term Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the very start, the founders were thinking in rather big terms for this new young country. Now, my thesis is this notion of an American purpose evolved over the years. First, to simply preserve a republic in a world of empires, then to preserve the Union, the last best hope, as Lincoln said. By the turn of the 20th century, it was Teddy Roosevelt with the balance of power, the role of a mediator. For Woodrow Wilson, it was to make the world safe for democracy. Notice he didn't say make everything into democracies, but he was trying to preserve the space for democracies. For Franklin Roosevelt, it was the four freedoms. In the Cold War, it was the leader of the free world. For Bill Clinton, it was the indispensable power. And so the question we face is, what will it be today? I have found that the nature of the purpose has involved three factors. Of course, the international context and how it changed. Second, the basis for public support. And third, some aspiration for extending the world of freedom or the belief in the power of small r republics. So I'll close with this observation. When I examined the foreign policy of Presidents Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, and President Trump within the framework of these five traditions, I came up with a conclusion that surprised me a bit. In many respects, the policies of Bush 41, only a one-term president, laid the foundation for the 16 years of Presidents Clinton and Bush 43. Now, I certainly recognize great differences in style and method of all three presidents. But consider the foundations that were laid by Bush 41. With Europe, NATO, Central and Eastern Europe, the European Union, Russia, the wider Middle East and the Gulf, North America, Latin America, trade, China, and even the only climate change treaty that was ever ratified by the Senate was in 1992, and it's the Framework Accord that is updated continually, for example, in the discussions that will be in Glasgow, Scotland later this year. I sensed that President Obama started to signal a turn, a slight diplomatic reticence, perhaps because this was the challenges of the global financial crisis, or maybe it was his own natural reserve that contributed to a perception of distance or a little diffidence, or a reliance on his faith, as he often mentioned about the arc of history. And then, of course, President Trump represented a sharp reversal. In fact, he consciously stressed breaks with the past in the US-led order of alliances, trade and economic networks, rights and freedoms. Trump favored transactional deal-making over partnerships, and narcissism triumphed over national purpose. So now we face the question of President Biden's approach. It's still early. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, I noted that the surveys of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs suggest that the American public believes that the country should play an active role in world affairs. In fact, 68% support that notion, a little higher than during the Cold War. 68% also favor a shared leadership role, compared with 24% that would favor US dominance. 2/3 of the respondents believe globalization benefits the US. Nearly 3/4 think that international trade is good for the economy. And support for NATO has stayed steady at about 73%. Yet all of you know these attitudes are inchoate, and much will depend on the president and how other leaders shape them. Events and the responses to them will matter a great deal. And that's why I think this enterprise that is being recognized for its first year today, the American Purpose, is particularly important, because I think it can play a significant role in encouraging this debate about the US role in the world going forward. So my counsel, as all of us discuss it, is to keep America's pragmatic traditions in mind, to keep focused on results, outcomes, performance, not just the intellectually challenging theories and grand strategies. Ask what we're seeking to accomplish and how and with whom. After all, we have a great historical experience upon which to draw. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. That was exceptionally stimulating. And we're going to open it up to questions now. And I'm going to, while you all are collecting your thoughts, I'm going to ask first, Bob, if I may. It relates to the role of alliances in advancing American interests. The last section of your book has the header, an end and a beginning. The first portion of that last section is devoted to George Herbert Walker Bush. I think you called him alliance leader. Three thoughts or three parts of one question, if I may. Speak a little bit to President Bush, Bush 41, as one says, to his gifts and skills and those of James Baker III, your former boss. Speak to us a little bit too about Trump Biden, because it has been bumpy and arguably for different reasons. And then finally, we want to fix things. We want to manage things. Take us forward, advice to the new administration, this context, parentheses, you've written for us about this. After Afghanistan, a way forward. Michelle, if you would kindly, when you have a moment, put that piece, recent piece for American Purpose in chat. But Bob, you've said that history is dynamic. There are opportunities, threats, contingencies. Start with that bit of history, if you would, but plant us into this moment and take us forward. We'd love your counsel.
Well, as many in this with this group would know, President Bush 41 was, in a sense, his professional life grew up in the American alliance era. That is a young naval aviator in World War II on to his presidency. And he had a deep interest in international affairs. He didn't consider himself a great conceptualizer. He was actually somewhat skeptical of intellectual errors. But one thing that characterized the conduct of his diplomacy was that he was in frequent personal contact with world leaders. Bob Gates recounted that when President Bush first came into office and started to call foreign leaders, they were shocked and surprised. They thought they didn't know it was really the President of the United States, but it was his way of trying to stay informed and having a sense of their interests and perspectives. And he conducted himself, quite rare, he was a true gentleman. At the same time, he was a fiercely competitive man, and people often miss this. He wanted to win. And his partnership with Baker, my boss, was obviously fundamental. I think as historians examine this period, that will become even more important. Because Baker was the person on point. Baker was focused on the theme that I've emphasized today, results, how to get things done, how to put together coalitions, how to handle the negotiations. And so Bush and Baker were in some ways competitive with one another. They were almost like an older and younger brother, but they had a trust and an understanding of what one was about, I think was critical to their success. And the reason I titled that chapter An End and a Beginning goes to the point that I closed with in these remarks, in that many people look at Bush 41 and the focus on German unification, the end of the Soviet Union, and then the Gulf War, and they sort of see it as the last chapter. Whereas I've suggested, if you look at issues like NAFTA, the Gulf, his decisions in dealing with China, trade policy, climate change, in many ways, he lays the foundation for that which is to come. Now, having said this, he's a one-term president. And so this is the caution. This is the president who spent an awful lot of time on foreign affairs. He enjoyed it. He had some significant domestic successes as well that people forget. The American for Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act amendments, the first big budget deal that the Clinton administration then built on. Not bad for 4 years, but he was seen as giving up his no tax pledge, and then with an economic recession sort of lost the political tiller. So there's a caution there, which I think it'll come back a little bit to your question about the role of Biden today. On the Trump to Biden connection, your second part, Trump, there's just no way around it. Trump represents a break with all these traditions that I talk about. He was dismissive of his alliance partners. He didn't see systemic interests. Everything was transactional, and frankly, everything seemed to focus on him. This goes beyond the issue that I find even more fundamental, which is his adherence or lack thereof to constitutional principles and norms, and ultimately, frankly, encouraging an insurrection against a peaceful transfer of power. I think if there's any issue that will be the legacy for us now going forward, and you can see it in our political debate, this questioning of the peaceful transfer of power, of losing elections, is absolutely fundamental. I've been part of some very close elections. I was down in the Florida recount. I know how these go, but I would never have believed that the United States elected membership would doubt the fact that when you lose, you have to turn over power peacefully. That'll be a fundamental issue going forward. I think for Biden, going back a little bit to the Bush analogy, I'll even start one further back with Ronald Reagan. When Baker was chief of staff with Reagan in 1981, he said, "Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery." Well, I think for Biden, his priority has had to be that of overcoming COVID and economic recovery. And for his White House staff, I'm certain that is their principal preoccupation. And you can see some of the anxiety over the past few months when the vaccines have started to come out, but not the full way we would perhaps had hoped to bring things back to normal, the uncertainties about the spread of COVID still going on. And I think this will be the key issue that guides the administration. Now, not surprisingly, the first steps in the foreign policy, in a sense, were extension of the domestic agenda. And it's important to recall here that President Biden has probably got more legislative experience than any president since LBJ, and he has a huge plate of issues that he's trying to deal with, and that takes time of a president. But this would lead naturally to the so-called transnational agenda. And this is an area where I think there have been some initial stumbles. There's certainly opportunity to rectify it. But take, for example, immigration. I think the administration has struggled because it wants to show a humanitarian face of the issue, but it looks like it's losing control of the southern border, and that, of course, will have political implications. I've been a little surprised about its approach internationally to the pandemic, or as I refer to it, biological security, because I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge. I had suggested to some in the transition process that they look at the Bush 43 PEPFAR proposal for HIV/AIDS, which probably did more for sub-Saharan Africa than anything in American history. Because what was important about that proposal was not just the vaccines and the financing, but working on the whole healthcare delivery system. And from my work in this area, which I've tried to stay in touch with people in Africa and others, there are key issues here about all on the supply chain to grab the ingredients for the vaccine production and then the delivery. Interestingly, in a number of African countries, because they've had problems of epidemics in the past of different diseases, they're actually, a number of them have healthcare delivery systems, including cold storage for vaccinations for animals that you could draw upon here. Now, I think we're going to see probably this week the administration try to regain some ground on this. But I hope that they do more than just sort of pledge resources. I think this is a classic issue given America's strength as a society, private and public sector, that could play a leading role with the multilateral institutions. And it has a connection with the third topic on the transnational agenda, which is climate change. I've been warning that if they are unable to deal with some of the anger in developing countries by the time of the November climate change summit, you're going to find a very difficult environment in putting together the diplomacy for that. As I mentioned, I was involved with, I was the lead US person for the 92 Framework Agreement, and I was involved with recovery after Copenhagen when I was at the World Bank. And it's important to understand what will happen in Glasgow is a continuation of that 92 framework. What countries are supposed to come up with is revised national action plans. So it's an issue that I touched on. It's not only sort of your overall aspirations in terms of modeling or degrees change, but it actually is going to require a diplomacy to get the major carbon and greenhouse gas emitting countries to have specific action plans and to bring along broader public support, whether it's from small island states or sub-Saharan Africa and others. And I honestly don't know how that's going to go. I know that Secretary Kerry has been traveling around the world, but you're going to need a special design for India, for China, for Brazil, for Indonesia, bringing it together with the other parties. This is going to be a very, very challenging task. Now, beyond the transnational agenda, of course, you've got the ongoing problems, cybersecurity, terrorism. And the biggest challenges are, in my view, the rise of China and the future of free societies. Now, the natural way the US would deal with these would be through this alliance network. And so in that sense, success with the transnational agenda could help in terms of building the alliance network. The missing piece, however, in Biden's multilateralism is trade policy. And you can see this, for example, in the recent announcement with Australia and the UK and the Pacific. I think that's a very important step, not only with the submarines, but frankly, it's really setting a pattern for future defense, industrial, and technology cooperation that could be quite helpful and productive. I'm certain the countries in the region, Japan, India, others, look upon it positively. There's a debate about how one could have handled it with France, and we could discuss that more. But the parts that is really missing is, where is the economic strategy in East Asia? So if, for example, the United States feels for political reasons it can't rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I've suggested why not try a digital accord, which is where a lot of the trade energy has moved even before the pandemic, and certainly now afterwards. And that really touches on the third point you mentioned about the way forward after Afghanistan. What I was trying to do in that piece that I wrote for you was to make a strategic point, which is retreats are always dangerous, whether in military or in diplomatic terms. And I analogize to Nixon and Kissinger, that from day one had to face the challenge of a defeat in Vietnam, and how the opening to China was in part an offsetting initiative to reposition the American diplomacy on the larger chessboard. And so my suggestion was that the Biden administration needs to think about a countervailing initiative. One that I had suggested was something along the lines of the COVID policies that I've talked about, although I'd still like to see the United States take a more leading role. Another could be in dealing with some of these trade and economic issues in Asia, which might be politically difficult, but show the United States commitment. But to give credit where credit is due, I think the arrangement with Australia and Britain on defense technology and submarines is a good example of showing some initiative in the aftermath. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't pay a price for the ongoing sort of difficulties and trauma in Afghanistan. We do, and we should handle that as best we can. But what I'm suggesting is it's important to connect the dots of these policies across a larger region, and that will ultimately be the test of how we recover.
Thank you very much. Michelle will help me if I missed raised hands, but I think Joan William has a hand up, if I'm right. I will come back in a moment. Bob, any other hands up right now, Michelle? So I'm going to go ahead, Bob, with my next question, which is...
Sorry, Jeff, we did just get a hand up, actually. Jackson James.
Jack James, and you two know each other well. And Jack James, you have the floor. You're muted, Jack.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Bob, there is an article in Foreign Policy right now talking about the difference between the so-called restrainers and the interventionists. I think that's a relatively artificial plastic division, but it seems to be carrying traction. And I wonder what you think of that debate, particularly with an eye on Congress, which is one of the areas of weaknesses that you mentioned in your analysis. Where is the John McCain today? But can you talk a little bit about that battle between those two apparent schools of thought and where that may be headed?
So Jack, since I haven't read the piece, you got to give me a little bit more color on what the restrainers and the others are.
Well, the Quincy Institute approach type of thing, where the United States has been overstretched for so long it has to come back home. Some people might say that's a foreign policy for the middle class. The interventionists arguing we don't have that choice. We are on the global scene in all cases, and we need to continue down that road. That is a battle that is old to the country, but I just thought you'd have a better understanding of what is taking us today.
So Jack, I'm glad you raised that, because in a way you bring us back to the point that I began with, which is at a time like this, you're going to hear a lot of conceptual, semi-theoretical debate, of different types of realism versus idealism, sort of restrainers versus interventionists. And as I suggested, I don't mean to dismiss sort of the sort of intellectual engagement on those topics. What I'm trying to share from my experience, however, is that the reality is made by how people deal with the individual problems of their era. So, for example, will the United States play a leading role in dealing with biological security, not only in the near term, but also sort of looking out? There was a opinion piece in one of the newspapers today by Larry Summers and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Tharman of Singapore about a G20 study about future biological security. And what they're drawing attention to is not only the need to help developing countries today, but the fact that what we've seen over the past actually decades is an increased frequency and cost of these viral incidents. And it's a function of the fact that you're having increased interaction among wildlife, livestock, and humans, the zoonotic viruses. And when I've spoken to some leading virologists around the world, they estimate that for a relatively modest sum, given the others we're talking about, I think it's about $1.3 or $4 billion, we could probably analyze the composition of the zoonotic viruses that we don't even know kind of how to be able to deal with them. Now, the piece that comes out of this G20 report is talking about monitoring the systems, early response systems, investment in fast turnaround production of vaccines. This is what I mean by the practical problem solving steps, right? And similarly, what I tried to touch on with climate is, climate for some people has become a hugely symbolic issue. It's an issue of sort of existence. The reality will be what gets done at that climate conference in Glasgow will require old-fashioned diplomacy. How do you get the 10 or 15 major economies to make commitments? How do you bring along, for example, with adaptation strategies, the small island states? Could you do something for soil carbon for African agriculture that bring them along? And so the point, the reason I tried to write the book is that I tried to go back through 200 years and say, look at the American experience and look at the issues of the day. And this is how people tried to address them and make your own assessments. Now, in that context, of course, there's an understanding, there's a legitimate set of questions about, does the US overextend itself? Where will it extend its resources? With alliances, where do you put your security commitments? But even there, what I was trying to say, Jack, and you know this story well, the alliance system you created in 1947-49 was not something that somebody sat down and drew a blueprint on. It came out of these events in a relatively brief period. But then it also had to be customized and adapted over time. And the reason I'm stressing this is that, again, a part of this I was hoping for younger generations. And with some of my friends who've started to use the book in universities, I've been modestly encouraged that the students like the problem solving approach, because frankly, they've been looking at critical studies through much of their academic work, and they kind of develop a sense of hopelessness. And here's a sense of how people can try to address problems. And so I think, underneath this at all, in a way that the sort of the way you pose the question, does raise the issue about public support. And as I've suggested in my remarks, there's sometimes an attitude among some of the sort of policy-making community that the American people won't support this type of deeper engagement. I just don't believe that's the case, and the numbers don't show that. However, it is true that it's the role of leadership in catalyzing this, and it's often based on events. So I suppose one aspect that I've sort of evolved my views on over time, Jack, was that, as you may know, Harold Macmillan was famous after he won an election, where he was asked about his plans, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I never quite liked that, because I like the idea you come in and you have some sense of what you want to accomplish. but there's a lot to that in how you respond to events. And to link this a little bit with the piece I wrote for American Purpose and that Jeff drew out, where you can connect the dots is that when you have an event like Afghanistan, one should be trying to think about where else one will take strategic initiatives. And I suppose the last sort of aspect I'll say on this, and here I'm perhaps being a slight bit contrarian with the norm these days, is that, look, take China. If anything, we have a bipartisan attitude towards China. We're all sort of hostile, but under my approach, I would ask, okay, I understand the nature of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party and what they're trying to do, but what is it we're trying to accomplish? How are we going to do so? Do we have an attitude or do we have a policy?
Jack, thank you. Bob, thank you very much. Michelle, alert me when I am missing a hand, but right now I'd like to follow on, Bob, and ask you a question that connects the domestic and the international foreign policy. And you were touching on this, but I ask you to dig a little bit deeper. The current GOP, how do you read the tea leaves? How do you understand currents and trends? It seems to me, if you agree, that at this moment, post Donald Trump included, at this moment, the pragmatists, at least on Capitol Hill, do not have the upper hand. How do you see that?
Well, if I view this purely in political analysis terms, and I've said my life is stretched across these two worlds, although I came from the policy side, I would suggest, Jeff, that it's important to watch what happens to the 10 Republican House members that voted for impeachment. We've already seen one of them decide he's not going to run for re-election. Those will be the indicators of whether one could oppose Trump and survive and lead for a potential future. Second, as a matter of principle, I think it's very important to have at least two parties, one to be governing and one to be a legitimate and reasonable opposition. And so I think that the Trump legacy for the Republican Party is extremely dangerous for the reasons that I mentioned. You can disagree on policy issues. People can be protectionists. I'm not. I don't think that we compete well with China by closing ourselves off. I think our strength is our openness. But the fundamental part is accepting the rules of the constitutional game. And as I said, that includes the willingness to lose elections. And the process of losing elections is normally a painful one for parties. At first they blame it on the voters, then they blame it on their advisors, and eventually they blame it on they recognize that it's themselves that has to sort of change. And that's how parties sort of revive themselves. I think there are a number of members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, that are unhappy with this situation. You tend not to hear as much about them because the ones that make the news are the ones that are kind of out on the fringe, whether for Republicans or Democrats. One former Republican congressional leader said to me, there's about a third that were deeply uncomfortable with Trump, a third that were believers in Trump, and there's about a third that are uncomfortable, but they're afraid of him. And I think that's probably the balance that we'll see sort of play out over the sort of election period. And so I think the worrisome aspect for me is that the Democratic Party has its own challenge now. You can see between its what loosely called the progressive wing and sort of the center left. You can see this playing out in the legislative process for the bills that Biden will have to sort of navigate. And I'm hopeful that if the American electoral process sort of works out, that we'll eventually have the resiliency to sort of recover from this situation. But I have to admit, it's a painful process to see many days. The one other part, though, that I draw attention to, which is critical in understanding the United States, is that for all the difficulties on the governmental scene, it's important to keep an eye on America's private sector. And here I don't only mean businesses, I also mean the broader civil society. I think that is ultimately the source of America's resilience. And I just speak personally, I've spent more time in recent years working with some of the companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that are trying to come up with technological solutions to a whole range of issues. And it's pretty inspiring. I mean, frankly, most of the leaders of these companies are either immigrants or children of immigrants, and they're highly motivated by trying to sort of address a problem. I think the technology policy intersection is often sort of scratchy and rough and will have to be worked through depending on its aspects. But I think foreigners often misread America because they don't understand that that aspect of American society is the core strength of the system.
Thank you. I want to turn to Will Quinn. You have the floor, and please, if you would briefly introduce yourself.
Great. Bob, great to see you again. It's Will Quinn. I'm a graduate student and a fellow at SAIS, and used to work for John McCain in the Senate on the Armed Services Committee. So I loved the book, Bob, and I was actually struck by something in your chapter on Bush 41 that I wanted to ask you about. You were referenced when you worked on a second-term economic plan. And so I want you to put on your domestic cap for a moment for President Bush, the agenda for American renewal. And I guess it strikes me that there's been sort of a, as other questions have suggested, sort of a moribund kind of approach to economic thinking domestically on even the fundamentals for US foreign policy, particularly on the Republican side. So my question is, if you were to sort of put the Bob Zoellick domestic policy cap on when you're looking abroad to some of these points, what would be that agenda today? You know, we've kind of gone through a paradigm that was very focused on austerity. And then before that, sort of a kind of compassionate conservatism that sort of swung back and forth in different ways. But where do you see that going forward? Because it seems to me the absence of that produced some of the populist backlash that we saw in 2016 and going forward. So yeah, just looking for hopeful ideas and sort of the pragmatic take that you offer so well.
Well, I'm very appreciative of your discovery of that. It turns out, I think I might have the only hard copy of the Agenda for American Renewal. I'm not sure there's one at the Bush Library. At some point I'll have to sort of give them a copy. But some of the presets of that actually would still apply today. And just to put it in historical context, one of the things we learned from the polls when I went over with Baker to the White House in August of '92 was that if we tried to run ads that emphasized President Bush's foreign policy skill, it actually hurt us because people say, yeah, we understand he's good abroad, but what's he doing for us, right? So the question was, how could you link his international skill and reputation domestically? I still believe in, as I discussed in the book, that trade broadly written is a key part of that, how we interact with the world with technology and standards. And frankly, this is one of the areas from the Trump period we're falling behind because, as you probably know, actually the growth in manufacturing goods trade started to slow around 2008, but you saw this big surge in services and particularly data and digital, and it's really only been accelerated by the pandemic. But traditionally, the United States used to, in a sense, lead the negotiations in cutting edge topics because we had a cutting edge sector. So whether it be the standards or the rules or norms, and we really haven't been doing that. It's one reason that I would, if I were USTR these days, I'd be focusing on a digital accord. But the other part of it in that agenda, which would be true today, is you have to help people adapt to change. So if you take some of the other answers I've already given today, I think rather than just have sort of blueprints or structures, you need a flexibility and an adaptability. And that means whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's pensions, it's best to have your social safety net programs directed at individuals so that people can move, they can adapt. And we've learned something, and frankly, there's been a lot of research on this from other countries, including some at the World Bank, how to do this efficiently and effectively. Michael Strain of AEI wrote a piece recently that was pretty good. He was in commenting on the reconciliation bill that you see debated these days. Rather than just talk about the amount, what troubled him was, in a sense, it was sort of trying to make the United States into a European social democracy, but based on our inefficient programs. And so if you wanted to try to do this, you would actually want to try to learn some lessons about how to maintain incentives and support. So I think, the challenge for the United States that engages in the world is to continue to focus on our core strengths. And I mentioned this being our openness. So this is in contrast with Trump's view. In my perspective, our openness to ideas, to people, to goods, to capital, to competition, this is ultimately what allows America to reinvent itself. And certainly in the story of immigration, I mean, you can see the attraction of talented people to America playing a very, very important role. So you want to keep an open society. And therefore, by the way, in your response to China, you don't want to try to imitate what China does by closing people off or stopping people from going to your universities or scaring them or others. You want to play the strength of having America be the magnet. But then you also need to help people adapt to change while preserving the incentives. Within that framework, you can have lots of experimentation. I mean, so again, just to give you one small idea that I was not successful with when I was on the trade side is that I often like the idea, wanted to experiment with something called wage subsidies. And what I mean by that was the United States at that time spent about $18 to $20 billion a year on worker training, adjustment programs. We had many, many programs in many different agencies, I think 9 different agencies, 60 or 70 programs. They weren't very effective. But in what I have observed is many private sector companies are now, for their own reason, focusing on different skills certification and training. And so the challenge would be if you lose your job, and let's say you're earning $60,000 a year, you may be reluctant to take a new job at $40,000 a year, but probably getting back into the workforce, getting trained in a new area is the best thing you can do. So you could have a program that could take $20,000 and make up some difference for some period of time with some different types of limits. Now, my own view about policy is that it's often good to use pilots. So before we want to create $1 trillion program, try these things and sort of see how they work. But it's that concept of using the private sector and markets and incentives, but recognizing you need to help people adapt to change. I think, Will, though, one other point here, and that is, we live, and this is certainly an area of the American purpose, it should be a good forum for debate. For this anxiety, how much of it is economic? How much of it is identity? My own sense is that, and frankly, people who make their living more on the political side have sort of agreed with me on this, is that I think some of the political turmoil you saw over the past 5 or 6 years was based less than sort of on economic disruptions and more on a sense of people's uncertainty of their place in society. And this is the large scale illegal immigration. In many parts of the country, it didn't necessarily affect people or it created an added workforce. But if you're in a small town and all of a sudden half the kids don't speak English and you wonder about the quality of the public schools, that will scare people. And so one of the issues, I'm always been actually a supporter of immigration, as I said, but it's important to recognize these aspects of what got people scared in society. And so I think these questions about identity and place in society may be just as important. And you can see this filter through the political debate. And you can see different parties trying to appeal to what they think, sometimes backward looking, sometimes a different nationalism, sometimes a different social support, in different set of areas. But I think that's where the debate will play out.
Hey, thank you, Will. Thank you, Bob. We are in the home stretch. I'm going to keep everybody on time, including our guest of honor. But John William, if I could call on you, you have the floor.
Can I ask a question? Is that to me?
Yes, please. You're invited to ask. Go ahead and
thank-
tell us who you are, John.
Oh, thank you so much. Robert, thank you so much for your great speech. I agree with your, idea in your paper that three strategies are American. I ask, my question is that, besides that three strategies, and do you consider some, other factors that could be influence, that make culture influence, that would be change some making decision method or making decision, to change something about culture. Sometimes this culture related to the economic, but right now maybe seems people did not find some way to have good influence of culture that can generate positive contribution to the economy. So my question is that besides that three strategies, do you think some option about something can change, can make a little change about culture? I mean, there's not, maybe just change a little, culture factor that will give people the much better making decision method. So something about that, to think about something about culture. Yes, thank you.
So if I understand the question properly, I think, part of this goes to the nature of America's culture. And as I've suggested with in the answers to the question so far, I believe that the strength of the society is one of adaptation. If you think about all the changes that I cover from the period in the book, not only geographically, but in dealing with slavery and dealing with immigration and in dealing with a whole series of changed circumstances, that the strength of the country is its ability to adapt. And the rest of the world, particularly authoritarian systems, also will deal with these strains, but you often don't see it on the surface because it's not sort of an open system. And so what I would add to that, however, and this is one other aspect behind the book, is that I think it's important as people adapt that they have some sense of hopefulness or possibility, and that people can address problems. And I've had some worry, but I'm not as close to it. I'm not in the university world. I don't have children in school, that there's a bit of an attitude now where everything is kind of criticized, hopeless, failure, negative. And to put it in the simplest terms, people need heroes. Sometimes people need myths. People need a sense of kind of what they of models. Now that doesn't mean that we don't analyze and criticize and find the faults. Of course, that should be a natural part of the process. But you need some sense that it's possible to continue to make progress as a society. And I think the United States has demonstrated that, often with twists and turns and difficulties. So I guess what I would add to sort of the general sense of the American culture and adaptation is we need to maintain this ability of looking ahead, trying to see how one can improve, recognize faults, but then try to see how you could still make advances. And that's where I keep coming back to the private sector of the United States. It's not a surprise that our government now and then gets locked in impasses. The system wasn't designed for efficiency. It was designed to actually limit impositions on liberty. So I'm not so troubled by that. I think there's a political skill in trying to sort of bring people together that sometimes is lost. What I mentioned on the political culture side goes to this critical aspect of needing to understand the basic rules. And the basic rules are an electoral process where we have peaceful transfers of power and accept the voter's choice.
John, thank you, Bob. Thank you very much, you all. We are really how fast 75 minutes goes. Let me, as a penultimate comment, remind you all that this conversation is part of a 3-day virtual conference marking 1 year American Purpose. And we're going to start tomorrow morning with an early bird session, 8 a.m. Eastern, with culture critic and writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, hosted by our podcast host, Bart College historian Richard Aldous. But to the main event here, to the community and the participants who joined, warmest thanks. We promised experience, deep knowledge, history, and a compass, and we got that from Bob Zoellick today. Bob, congratulations on the book. I'll hold up again, forgive me, uncorrected page proofs of last summer, but I have it on Kindle on my iPad. Could you hold it up, please? America in the World. Thank you, Bob. A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Bob, thank you for your time, your political and intellectual leadership in so many ways, on so many fronts. And I think we properly owe you a final word, a reflection that we could take forth. So Bob, over to you for a final thought or two.
So I just want to thank you, Jeff, and Michelle, and now Rebecca. I think all of us know the challenge of launching such an enterprise. And you're doing it on a shoestring, but I think you're doing it very effectively. And I'm so delighted to see that the participants you've drawn in, and people like Frank and others, and Ms. Lipset and others, people that sort of reflect America's past experience with debating these issues. So I just want to thank you and say, keep at it.
Bob, thank you so much to everybody. Great afternoon, great evening, more soon. Thank you all. Thanks, Bob.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Bye now.